Hello, and welcome to episode 59 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Branden Fitelson, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Northeastern University. Branden's research interests lie mainly in the philosophy of science, logic, and epistemology. His recent papers have focused largely on the role of probability in inductive logic and epistemology. He also has active interdisciplinary projects involving the psychology of probability and confirmation judgment and applications of automated reasoning to formal philosophy. He is currently working on a book on confirmation theory, which will trace both its historical and philosophical development. Before teaching at Northeastern, Branden held teaching positions at Rutgers, UC Berkeley, San Jose State, and Stanford, and visiting positions at the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy and the Institute for Logic, Language, and Computation at the University of Amsterdam. Before entering philosophy, Branden studied math and physics at Wisconsin, and he worked as a research scientist at Argonne National Laboratory and as a NASA contractor. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Branden. Dr. Branden Fitelson, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Friday morning?
Oh, great, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Thanks once again. And as we have just chatted before coming on the air, you're enjoying your time in Denver at the Central APA, American Philosophical Association Conference. Is that right?
That's right. It's a lot of fun. A lot of my old friends are here, and it's great to be able to talk philosophy with so many great people. Great. Are these old friends from graduate programs, positions across the country? Yeah. Just from all over, from different ways of meeting people. But yeah, tons of different people from different parts of my career. Cool. And you mentioned that you like one of your favorite ways to do philosophy is to talk to people. So have you had any good conversations so far? Amazing. Yeah. I mean, that's basically what I've been doing the whole time. So, yeah, I mean, that's why I love to come to conferences, especially the APA, because there's so many good philosophers here. So I really get amazing feedback from people. Yeah. So what do these conversations look like for you? Are you sharing, a draft of your work? Are you bringing up ideas or arguments and you guys are fleshing things out? How does doing philosophy in a social way work for you? Yeah, I mean, it just so happens that right now I have a new paper that I've just presented a couple of times and I'm very excited about. And so there's a lot of people here who are experts on the relevant stuff, and it's just been very valuable to talk to them. So I've already had like a half a dozen conversations just about that project. Wow. That's really something. Yeah. Have you, I guess, gleaned anything of interest for this particular project? Yeah. It's really sharpened the arguments, and it's helped a lot already. Okay, great. Well, I'm eager to hear a little bit, perhaps, about this upcoming project. But before we do that, why don't we take a step back and find out a little bit more about your origin story and how the heck you got into philosophy in the first place. So tell us, Branden, where did you grow up? I grew up in upstate New York in a town called DeWitt, New York, which is a small town outside of Syracuse. My dad was a physics professor at Syracuse in the early 70s. He later got into the private sector, but I grew up. That's where I grew up. We were in Syracuse till I was in high school. Wow. So you grew up in the college town? Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yep. All right. What was that like? That was fun. I mean, it's funny because I went to Hebrew school with Jason Stanley, who's a famous philosopher now, and so we go way back. And so when you're in a college town like that, you meet a lot of people whose parents are faculty, and it was a very intellectual upbringing in that sense. Yeah. So physics, was physics of interest to you growing up? Yeah. So I started off just doing mathematics and physics, and in fact, that's what I got my undergraduate degrees in too. Yeah. I didn't get into philosophy formally until after that. Mm-hmm. So what happened was I was thinking I would go to school and study physics. I actually was going to go to Columbia in New York and study physics and math, but I ended up instead going to Wisconsin with all my friends that I grew up with and that I went to camp with. Yeah, I'm kind of like this. I tend to follow people in my life that I'm close with, and it's worked out well for me, but it's not a very strange trajectory in my life. It's zigzaggy kind of thing.
What kind of camp?
It was a Jewish camp. It was a Reformed Jewish camp. Okay. It's called the Joseph Eisner Camp Institute for Living Judaism. It's in Great Barrington in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. And there a couple people other than me became philosophers from there. So you may have heard of Tamar Gendler, who's now I think one of the provosts at Yale and is a great philosopher, and Aaron Zimmerman, who's a philosopher at UCSB. So this camp was a very intellectual camp. It created a bunch of philosophers, weirdly. And I had many other friends from there too, and we all decided to go to Wisconsin, which was a great decision for me, but it was a real departure from what I was planning to do. It turned out to be really fun, and it really led to everything else that came later.
You mentioned this was sort of an intellectual kind of camp, or maybe the consequence of it seemed to turn out to be. Like what, in terms of growing up at this camp, was there, questions related to big questions of philosophical import? Was there, or just where you just happened to be connected with a bunch of different people that, had shared similar interests?
I think it was a little bit of both. So, there was, in Judaism, there's a big emphasis on education and discussion and things like that. But mostly it was just a bunch of really smart kids happened to be together there. Yeah. And, then when that happens, you get a bunch of really smart people together. Interesting ideas are exchanged and fun stuff happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say there's a strong connection between those who practice or are very involved in Judaism and the Jewish religion and philosophy?
Certainly there's a strong connection to education. Yeah. And I think that leads to having serious discussions about various issues. And once you're doing that, philosophy is not far off. So I guess it's not that surprising, but I do think it also had a lot to do with just the people who happened to be there. Were just very philosophical people.
Mm-hmm. So your original plan, though, is mathematics and physics. So what kinds of either career plans and or questions were you interested in pursuing as a budding undergraduate?
Yeah, so it's funny because as an undergraduate, all 4 of those summers that I was an undergrad, I was an intern at a NASA contractor near Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. Whoa. And so I basically worked at NASA for 4 summers. And after I graduated, they offered me a full-time job. And I was working at NASA, basically. And decided that science in that, and in the way it's done as an organized practice really wasn't for me. But I didn't realize that until I actually was in in a job, working that way. I loved it. It was a great job. But I realized after that philosophy, and I had taken a bunch of philosophy classes at Wisconsin, with Elliot Sober and Malcolm Forster and Ellery Ells and people like that. And philosophy science classes. And I really loved that stuff, but I didn't realize how much I loved it and how much of a calling that really ultimately would be until after college when I was already working at NASA. And I missed those seminars and those discussions. And that's what prompted me to change my career and get back and try to get a PhD in philosophy, which was a kind of crazy thing to do, but I've done a lot of kind of crazy things, I guess. I had a great job and I was very comfortable, but I thought, hey, why not be a philosopher?
Right. Well, so if you would humor us for those of us who haven't worked at NASA, could you tell us a little bit about? So I imagine this was interning through the summers and then working prior to in between undergrad and graduate school. Is that right?
I had a full-time job after undergrad. And I wasn't planning on going to grad school right away. You know, when you work at a place like that, you know, they'll pay for you to get advanced degrees. And I was thinking that's probably what I do, because then it'd be free. And there's, you know, and the University of Maryland is a great place to do that, which is right near there. But I just couldn't do that. I realized I was so kind of obsessed with philosophical questions that I just needed to be a philosopher.
Can you recall the kinds of questions you were interested in at the time that were pulling you away from the you know, practical, more applied science?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing that really, I think, got me, aside from reading Plato, so I spent a year reading the early dialogues of Plato with Terry Penner at Wisconsin, and that really sparked an interest in philosophy in me. But then I took a couple seminars in philosophy of science, and the one that really got me, I think, was with Malcolm Forster. It was philosophy of quantum mechanics. And we spent a lot of time thinking about probability and what probability means in science, specifically, say, in quantum mechanics. And that kind of stuff on the foundations of probability in physics, that really got me. And I couldn't stop thinking about probability after that in a philosophical way. And I'm still, the project I'm working on right now is about the philosophy of probability. So that's 25 years later or whatever.
Fantastic. So yes, and my assumption is that just in the science, like at NASA, you could do the work, but you know these kinds of questions were just not, you know, well, not that they're not important, but you know you really couldn't work on them.
Right, that's right. You know, NASA back then they were working on mission planning for lunar Mars. They were going to set up a way station on the moon and then use that to propel to Mars. That was a whole that project later got canceled because, you know, the funding situation at NASA changed a lot since the late 80s. And yeah, you were working on projects, and it was great. I mean, the scientists there were amazing. The managers I had were, I mean, they were fantastic. Yeah. But yeah, you're really committed to a certain program, a project, and you've got to just solve whatever problems are relevant to that project at the time. And that was great, but it wasn't the kind of questions that I really couldn't help but think about. You know, I just couldn't stop thinking about these other more foundational questions about science and probability specifically. But then it became more generally about the methodology of science. I got more and more into the methodology of science once I got to grad school. But it all started with thinking about physics and how probability in physics works. Okay. Which is a fun topic that I still think is fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so making the transition to return to graduate school, how was that? And I guess I'm curious about how your method and your approach to doing philosophy might have developed or changed from this transition from undergrad to science to working in graduate school.
It was kind of crazy. So you know, as I said, I'm the kind of person who just kind of follows people that I know and like. So I decided, hey, I want to be a philosopher. So I called Malcolm Forster. I just called him. And I'm like, suppose I wanted to be a philosopher. How would that work? And he's like, let me think about this and get back to you. And eventually it worked out that I was admitted to the PhD program there, but not immediately as a PhD student. I first had to get a master's degree because I took some philosophy course, but I didn't really have the background. So I took 4 years to get a master's and then 5 years to get a PhD. So I was in grad school for 9 years.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And so it was a major thing. And Malcolm told me that right at the beginning. He said, look, this is going to be, yes, you can do it, but it's going to probably take you 9 years, which turned out to be exactly the right number.
Why 9 years?
Well, because I came in with deficiencies, so it would take me a couple years just to make those up. And then he thought the smart thing to do would be to get a master's, which would take a couple more years, and then get a PhD. And he was right. This was absolutely right from the beginning.
That baseline philosophical foundation.
I just didn't have. I mean, I really didn't have the training at all. I'd taken some ancient philosophy and philosophy of science, and logic, but that was it. I didn't really. You know, I hadn't really done epistemology and metaphysics or, you know, just core analytic philosophy. I hadn't really done that. And so I spent a few years just doing that, got my master's, and then I took 5 more years to get a PhD. Sure. And I just got super lucky. This is like the story of my life. I mean, the story of my life is that I've been able to work at all these amazing places with the remarkable people from whom I've learned so much. And that's what's allowed me to keep doing this. And so wherever I was, so I went back to Wisconsin and I got to work with Malcolm, Elliot Sober, Ellery Els, Dan Hausman. I mean, it's an amazing group of philosophers of science. And I ended up publishing a bunch of papers with them in grad school. And that was really, once I had done that, I mean, I knew that that was the thing that I was going to do. But if it wasn't for those people, none of this ever happens, Yeah. But that's been the story of my life. So when I went to grad school, while I was in grad school, I ended up working at another national laboratory, Argonne National Laboratory, because I got interested in automated theorem proving, which is how do computers prove theorems in mathematics. Uh-huh. And the original research group on that was at Argonne National Lab. That's where they invented theorem proving back in the 60s. And I got to work with the most amazing Larry Wass, who is still living. He's in his 90s, and he was one of the pioneers of theorem proving. He was the first blind PhD in mathematics in the United States.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, blind from birth. And so this is the story of my life. I just keep running into the most amazing people, and they teach me things, and then I run into more people, and I learn more things. It's just been a miracle, one miracle after another, of running into just remarkable people and then working with them. So that's been the story for me all the way through.
So yes, and to not detract from your own, individual resolve to take on these really great challenges and to learn yourself. But it does sound like you've had a great benefit of being able to learn from others. Is that?
Oh, that's everything for me. So I'm a very collaborative person, and I really can only learn by talking to people. Yeah. I'm not very good at learning things by reading. I can do it, but it's much harder. So if I can just talk to someone for an hour, I can understand what they're doing. I'm good at that. I'm good at understanding people when I meet with them and talk to them. And so that's how I learn everything. And so I've just been lucky to one thing after another. And it continued after graduate school, So I was in this amazing situation in Madison. I was also working at Argonne National Laboratory and doing all that theorem proving stuff with those amazing people. And then when I graduated, the miracles continued. I got a bunch of jobs when I came out. And including Yale and Georgetown and other places. But I had to turn them all down because my wife decided not to go into academia, and she got this great job in California. So ended up unemployed as a philosopher in the Bay Area in 2000. Uh-huh. And that's not like a great position to be in. It's not super advisable. But, like I said, I just follow people that I love, and that's what I do. And it eventually worked out because I ran into this person named John McFarlane, who I just saw at the APA last night. Yeah. And he decided that I'd be a good colleague to have at Berkeley. And so I ended up being a professor at Berkeley, and I got tenure at Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And then my wife decided to get into academia. So we moved, and then I was a professor at Rutgers, which is an amazing department. I mean, wow. It's an unbelievably amazing department. And now I'm a professor at Northeastern in Boston, which is an amazing group of people. So that's the story of my life. I just follow good people around, and then that leads to more good people and more things that I learn, and more, that's just been how I've been doing it. But that's really just being fortunate. Sure. And I keep running into the right folks along the way that allow me to learn the right things to do the next thing I need to do.
Yeah. That's a testament to how important it is. Getting involved, because this isn't just knowing people. This is, from what I hear, is it's getting to learn and connect and do work with people.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. So people, if they're not interested in talking to you, that you're not going to learn anything from them.
Yeah.
So they have to be interested in talking to you. And I've been fortunate to keep running into people who, for some reason, I don't really totally understand why, have found it interesting to have me around to talk to. And that's really what's made everything possible for me, especially in philosophy. Yeah. And that continues to this day. I mean, being at this conference, what's allowing me to do research is that I have all these friends that know so much, and I can just talk to them, and they teach me things.
Wonderful. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about, some of your earlier projects or projects that you found to be the most telling of your philosophical work? perhaps things that you started working on at either in graduate school in Berkeley, or maybe like we can go over one or two that you found to be particularly involved a lot of self-development, and how they happened, and what's come of them.
Yeah. So I started off, like I was saying, I think about probability in physics, but then after taking classes with Ellery Els and Elliot Sober, I got more into the role of probability in scientific inference. So what's the role of probability in scientific methodology and in forming beliefs about scientific theories and things like that? And that led to, I wrote a dissertation on confirmation theory, which is Bayesian confirmation theory, which is just the use of probability to kind of model, people's formation of beliefs and changes of beliefs in scientific contexts. And I've been working on that ever since. I would say probably the most important thing was the initial work I did on confirmation theory. That I think that was very influential. That's certainly my most cited work. And I've basically continued to work on that sort of stuff. It relates also to the foundations of statistics. So really, it's generally the role of probability in inference. And I still love that stuff. And that's my favorite stuff to teach. And that's still, really where my heart is, I think. But I did eventually, because I was a professor at Berkeley and then Rutgers, that forced me to look at things in a more general way. And so that got me into just general epistemology. And when I was at Berkeley, we had a workshop called the Formal Epistemology Workshop back in 2004. And that was just, it was this great little workshop of people doing stuff mainly with probability and philosophy of science. And that became a whole area of philosophy over the next 15 years. And now it's an annual meeting. I'm not really involved. I'm not involved with the organization of it anymore, but I was for the first 10 years. And now it's a whole community. And like you can claim on your CV as an AOS, formal epistemology. That's like a thing.
Did you connect?
That wasn't a thing in 2003.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. Have you connected with any of the folks at Carnegie Mellon by chance?
Absolutely. Two of the first few meetings were hosted by CMU. They were very generous to us at the beginning. And, they're some of the real pioneers of the field and some of the real leaders of the field. And they have an institute. They have a center now for formal epistemology. And so they do, of course, some of the best work, and they've always done. And you could say the same thing about UC Irvine and Columbia. Right. And there's been all these places historically. So the formal epistemology workshops just gave all those people a place to meet, and it created this community of especially junior scholars. And then it just took off, and it's this remarkable thing. There were 85 submissions to FEW this year. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, it's, the first one, we just had like 10 papers, but they were all invited papers.
Sure.
And now,
now you can't
it's only
knocking down the door to get in. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like 15 years later, and now there's 85 submissions, and the quality of the work in that field is really amazing. So that's a thing I've been involved with socially in the profession. That that's got to be my greatest achievement of all things considered, is being part of that community and helping get that thing started. That has to be the thing that's the most important. It's just had such a broad impact around the world. And it's a really amazing thing. It was just a workshop, but we had the right people at the right time, who, created this amazing supportive and collaborative community. At the beginning, it was Kenny Eastwarren. Kenny's still instrumental in running the thing, and Mike Teitelbaum and Fabrizio Cariani and people like that at the beginning. And now it's just this huge community. There's so many amazing scholars that work on this stuff. I couldn't even list them all off. I mean, it's remarkable, you know. And
I can see the first one. It was at Berkeley, right? 2004, with you as the organizer and Sahotra Sarkar. Was that right?
It was actually Sahotra Sarkar's idea. So we got drunk one night at an APA in San Francisco, and Sahotra said, "You know what we should do? We should have a formal epistemology workshop, and it'll be our answer to the Rutgers Epistemology Conference, which is the mainstream of conference." And I didn't even know what the Rutgers Epistemology Conference was. To be honest, I didn't even know what epistemology was, I think, then, back in those days. And anyways, the next day I thought, oh, we had this crazy one-night stand. He'll never remember that he said this. And then he called me a few days later and said, no, we're doing this. And so for the first few of them, it was really Sahotra pushing me to do it. And then he kind of faded out after the first few years. And then it just took off and became this thing, this behemoth that it now is. Well, it's a wonderful thing, but it really has it's an international community that's thriving. I would say that's probably the thing I'm most proud of in my career. And, all the work I've done has been fun too, but really that's the best thing. Because now I have this community of amazing people that I can just reach out to.
That's wonderful.
And talk to about philosophy. And I can go to the meetings, but I don't even have to go to the meetings. I could just reach out to these people. They're all over the world now. And pretty much wherever I go in the world, and I travel a lot, I see people who've been touched by the formal epistemology workshops. And that's just a priceless gift. I'm really thankful for that.
Yeah, I really appreciate you going into the history of this and describing a bit about. There's been some great intellectual accomplishments by way of formal epistemology in terms of just general epistemology as well as philosophy of science. But this community seems to be a really big thing for you, and I imagine many others. It's really something. Then you have a community that you can talk with others, and it's hard to measure just how probably influential this has been, but I imagine it's been incredibly so.
I really think it has, and I think one of the main things that set it apart is how supportive and collaborative it is. Philosophy sometimes can be, and I love philosophy, but sometimes historically it can be a little navel-gazy, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, sure.
It can be a little. Everyone could be sort of in their own heads, writing their little papers. Individually. And at Few, it was always about collaboration. It was always about supporting your peers and helping them with their ideas.
Yeah.
And that continues, that spirit. And that's why it's been so successful, because if you're a junior scholar, especially, what you really need is peers that will help you think about things.
Yeah.
You need it at any age. I think it's a wonderful thing to have. But I think especially when you're a junior scholar in a field that's very, could be very competitive and difficult, just sociologically, having that group of people that you can go to is priceless. And that, I think, is why we attracted so many amazing scholars to the field. There was all these smart people, and all they needed was a little encouragement and a little support. And it really does, and that's all it takes. And then the next thing you know, you've got this whole community around the world. And I think that was really the difference maker, was how supportive and collaborative it is. And also the people are just brilliant and awesome and super. I mean, I could just rattle off so many names of people around the world that are now doing this stuff and have just, are carrying the torch of this kind of spirit of collaboration. Richard Pettigrew and Laura Bouchak and Sarah Moss. And I mean, I could just do this forever. Miriam Schoenfield. And I mean, I could just name 100 people that aren't just great scholars, but they care about their peers and they care about helping people figure things out. And that's what it's about for me.
No, that's wonderful. That's really great to hear. So I imagine this has been, so perhaps you could describe how this has grown over the years. How, from 2004 to now 2019, how have you seen this community change and develop, and perhaps interact with other communities?
It's just been amazing. So, they're back to that first dinner with Sahotra at Morton Steakhouse in Union Square, and all those bottles of Cabernet. He said it'll be our answer to the Rutgers Epistemology Conference. So flash forward 10 years, and the 10th meeting, I was a professor at Rutgers.
But why an answer? What do you mean an answer? I'm sorry, to the answer.
Oh, well,
for the context of this other kind of group.
So when Sahotra, right, that's good. So when Sahotra said our answer to the Rutgers Epistemology Conference, I think he was meaning to be slightly pejorative. Now, in a joking way.
Sure.
But I think he was meaning to say, how the traditional epistemologists do epistemology? We're going to show them. Now, that's not how I think of it at all. And we were drunk and he was joking. He was
of course.
But here's the amazing thing. Flash forward 10 years. Then I'm a professor at Rutgers, because that's where the two-body problem had led me from Berkeley. My wife and I got jobs at Rutgers, and I was there.
Yeah.
And Peter Klein, who is one of the great traditional epistemologists, and the guy who inaugurated the Rutgers Epistemology Conference, he and Ernie Sosa and people like that, he came to me when I got there, which, by the way, I was a spousal hire at Rutgers. Mm-hmm. And, when you're a spousal hire, you don't necessarily get the attention that like a star hire would get.
Sure.
But Peter Klein reached out to me and invited me to lunch. And he said to me, what we should do with the next Rutgers Epistemology Conference is we should co-locate it with the Formal Epistemology Workshop. And here's the thing. He paid for the Formal Epistemology Workshop out of his own personal research funds. Huh. This is the story of my life.
This very is what fortunate.
I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I keep running into people who aren't just smart and, great philosophers and great teachers, but they've been very kind to me. Yeah. And that's how this happened. So once we were co-located with the Rutgers Epistemology Conference, that's it. The fate was sealed. We were on a par with the best conference in epistemology, Simplicator. And it's just something you wouldn't have dreamt of 10 years before that. But it's thanks to Peter Klein and to the Rutgers epistemologists for being so supportive and recognizing that formal epistemology was a good thing, that at least the way we were doing it was a good thing. And I always like to say that the way I think about it is, we're helping the traditional epistemologists with their math homework. That's more along the lines of how I think of it, because my idea is we could be helpful to traditional epistemologists.
Yeah.
And of course, if we're not being helpful to traditional epistemology, then it's not clear how we're being helpful to philosophy.
Mm.
And so that's always been my view, that, we're all doing philosophy. We just have maybe different methods for ways of approaching it.
Yep.
And the question is, how can we help each other? And I really think we have managed, as formal epistemologists, to help traditional epistemologists in some cases clarify their concepts, clarify their arguments, and really be helpful. And I think that's always been the goal from my perspective, is to be helpful. And I think we managed to do that. Look, we convinced Peter Klein and Ernie Sosa, so we must have been doing something right.
Yeah. So we've talked sort of, generally about formal epistemology and the social structure of this community that has grown up. For those who might be in another kind of philosophy or in the science in general, what could you say are some of the major contributions that the work in formal epistemology, perhaps even your work, has offered to philosophy of science or the philosophy of community more broadly?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of examples. I guess probably I would say, if I had to pick one thing, I would say work in the foundations of the theory of rational choice, of decision theory, both social and individual choice.
Okay.
I think probably, if you broadly construed, that's been the most important, because that allows you to make progress on things like just what it means for scientists to make rational theory choices or rational choices of other kinds as groups and as individuals. And so broadly construed, these kind of applications and foundations of decision theory and game theory, and there in which I include, of course, all the recent work on agent-based modeling and social epistemology, people like Kevin Zollman at CMU and his students. Of course, I include all that stuff. And so I guess I'd have to say stuff involving the application and foundations of the theory of rational choice, both at the social and the individual levels, has been really, really helpful, I think, to philosophers of science and also to epistemologists generally.
Yeah. Okay. And so you mentioned, has work in formal epistemology been your main draw over your career, or have there been other avenues with which you've explored too?
I guess you'd have to say that formal epistemology has been my main philosophical thing. I do have this other very significant interest in using computers to solve problems in mathematics and logic.
Interesting.
And that's actually turned out to be very useful in philosophy. So I've published a bunch of papers in philosophy that use these computational techniques to solve problems that are relevant to problems philosophers care about, say involving probability or logic. And I guess I'd say those are the two main things. But what I've enjoyed the most are the projects that involve both.
Okay.
So I wrote a paper a few years ago on certain triviality results about how to assign probabilities to conditional statements. And that was discovered using these computational methods for probability that I developed. And so I love projects like that. I'm working on a project right now with a graduate student at MIT named Kevin Dorst, who's doing remarkable work on higher order probability. And there again, we were able to use computational methods to make a lot of progress and solve a lot of open problems there. And I love projects like that because it combines my two favorite things: probability, both as applied to philosophy, and also just how to reason theoretically about probability models. And I love both of those things, and projects that involve both, I mean, that's just the best for me. Those are my favorite. And so I tend to gravitate towards problems where I can do both of those things.
Yeah. Fair enough. Do you have perhaps a favorite paper or two that you feel like has been the most influential in your thinking?
Well, as far as influential, I guess I would have to be, I wrote a paper in 1998 about measures of confirmation, and I think certainly that's been the most influential. It's the most cited and has had the most, I think, if you'd say, impact. I mean, that's actually not my favorite.
Is that measuring confirmation of evidence, or is that?
Yeah, so it's about using probability to measure how strong a piece of evidence is for a theory or a hypothesis. And it turns out there's a lot of different measures of evidential strength in that sense. And I kind of explored the fact that there's all these different measures and they disagree in really surprising and radical ways. And that's what that paper kind of revealed. And that led to a lot of other work that relates to that. It's funny, though, because that's actually not my I mean,
sure.
Now looking back, it's a fun paper. I probably would write it differently now if I did it. I had to do it again. It was 20 some years ago. But actually, my favorite paper is a paper I wrote with Jim Hawthorne, which is called "The Wason Task and the Paradox of Confirmation," and that gives a very general Bayesian way of modeling both famous reasoning fallacies in cognitive science and classical paradoxes of confirmation, and sort of talking about the parallels between those and how analogous they are. I really love that paper. Also, I just love Jim Hawthorne. That was just such a fun project to work on. It's funny because that's like one of the least read papers. No one reads that. I mean, there's a few people who know it, who like it, but it's like, you know how that is. It's sort of like it's like when you're listening to an album, though the hit is not necessarily the band's favorite song on the album. If you know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm sure they play it a lot, and sometimes it's just it doesn't have maybe the same passion or meaning to you as
look, when I hear it on the radio, I dance to it.
Sure.
But I have my own favorites in the corpus. I actually think what I'm doing now, is just so interesting and so much more philosophically rich. So the projects I'm working on now on higher order probability and the
tell us a
value
little
of
about
knowledge.
those. Mm-hmm.
And I have all these cool projects now that are really, I think, philosophically much deeper and more interesting than that early stuff. I mean, I guess I'd say the stuff I'm doing now is actually my favorite,
Okay. Yeah. Could you just, why don't we take some time, to maybe, could you unpack a little bit about sort of like maybe just the main questions that you're looking to do, and then how you're going about attempting to address them?
Yeah, I guess the way you could unify all the stuff I'm working on is I'm interested in what rationality requires of people in terms of their degrees of confidence. So we all have degrees of confidence in different claims, and we generally use probability to model those degrees of confidence. And I'm interested in what are the rational requirements on someone's degrees of confidence, assuming that they're probabilities. And I think that unifies all the things I'm doing. So I'm looking at higher order probabilities and how that stuff, what are the rational requirements there? I'm looking at just ordinary kind of first order ways of evaluating evidence and what are the rational requirements there. And I think I've always really been working on that. I didn't always conceptualize it that way, but now in retrospect, I think that ties together pretty much all of my philosophical work. It's like, what does rationality require of degrees of confidence or just confidence in general? And that really unifies everything I'm doing.
That's a huge question. If we were to get closer to, or like having some sort of understanding, what are some of the consequences of that, of really understanding the relationship between rationality and these degrees of confidence?
I think there's a lot of ramifications. So, one thing I've been now doing, and the project I'm working on now, which I think is kind of a special case of the kind of stuff I'm going to be doing, is going back to old arguments that were supposed to be about rational requirements for confidence and rethinking those from just a very fundamental level of what is a rational requirement and how do those work. And I'm already noticing that when you do that, a lot of results and things from the literature that people thought showed certain things about rationality, actually, it's not clear that they do at all. And so I'm thinking that really, when you think very carefully about this stuff, it ends up forcing you to reorient a lot of the philosophical discussions that have happened in the last 30 or 40 years. And I'm going through that right now with a very famous result of David Lewis's from the 70s, the triviality results. But I think it's just a special case of a more general strategy, which is think hard about what it is to be a rational requirement for confidence, and then apply that back to some of these arguments that were supposed to be about rational requirements. And what happens is you end up reevaluating radically a lot of the things that have been said. At least that's what's happening to me. And so I think that kind of summarizes everything I'm doing. I'm thinking hard about the nature of rationality and then going back to classical kinds of arguments and results and rethinking them in light of these ways of thinking about rationality. That's sort of, I think, describes everything I'm doing right now. It really has had a profound impact on. So now I'm reevaluating everything I used to think about that stuff. That's kind of fun,
right? I mean, has there been any initial changes in your thinking since, like big shifts in? Yeah. This paper I'm writing right now on the triviality results, I think everyone's been wrong about what the significance of those results are for rationality. Ooh. And so I have a completely different way of approaching it and setting it up, which I think is superior and also more charitable to the sort of pioneers of that field. People like Ernie Adams and Bob Stalnaker and people like that. I think that people have viewed some of their work about conditionals and probabilities uncharitably because they haven't really been thinking the right way about rational requirements and how that applies to that work. So that's just an example right now. But more generally, I think this kind of thing is going to happen to me a lot moving forward. I'm going to look back at a lot of results that I thought I understood what their significance was for rationality, and probably change my mind significantly about what I think about that. And that's so exciting. I mean, it's one thing I love about philosophy. And so when I teach introductory logic, which is my favorite thing to teach, and everyone always asks me, isn't that boring? No, on the contrary, because, philosophy for me fundamentally is about slowing down the thinking. Mm. And what I've found is you can always slow it down a little bit more and then uncover just a little bit more. Even with very elementary things like just basic probability calculus and basic logic. Every time I teach that, I get new insights into how to think about the foundations, and that leads to new papers. In fact, most of my papers came from teaching, because when you teach something, or if you're like me and you're very much tied to verbal explanation, when you're forced to get in front of an audience and explain something, it forces you to get an understanding that's much deeper than what you might have had. And that's what keeps happening to me. Even in my intro logic class, I'm still getting papers out of I published a paper last year on Simpson's paradox that I discovered from coming up with exercises in probability for my intro logic students, my freshmen. Yeah. And that's not been unusual. When I taught an introductory probability course at Berkeley, I came up with a whole bunch of new stuff about confirmation theory because, you have to go back to the foundations and think, wait a minute, how does this work? Yeah. And just slow it down and really go through it from first principles again. And this, for me, always yields new understanding every single time I do it. I don't know. I'm also like that maybe with everything because I've been listening to the same albums
for like 40 years. And somehow every time I listen to him, I hear something new.
Yeah.
And I think but philosophy is especially like that, because things you thought you understood, you just think about them a little bit more slowly from first principles. And every time I do that, I get entirely new insights. So that's really what I'm doing again. I'm always going back to things I thought I understood and saying, wait a minute, how would I explain this to a freshman?
Yeah.
Let me just start over. And when I start over, I discover all these new things. I mean, philosophy is wonderful in that way, but maybe all of inquiry is that way when you look at it very carefully. But I think philosophy especially is about that. It's about reinvestigating the foundations, returning again to what you thought you understood, but just a little more carefully, a little slower.
Yeah.
And that's just how I'm doing it. And it just keeps generating new understanding. I'm not sure I understand why.
I mean, I can completely relate and understand the going back to something and seeing it in a new way, in a new light. I really like the metaphor, though, of slowing things down. I think that could actually be really pedagogically useful for teaching students. And like, is that sort of what you do in terms of, let's say you're teaching your introductory logic students how to do philosophy? Is that one of the things you kind of describe or explain? This is how to think about things?
Yes. Always return to first principles if you can, especially if you're in a theoretical context.
Yeah.
Always return to first principles and try to understand things from a very fundamental level. I actually think I stole this. I should give a shout out to John Campbell, who's my former colleague from Berkeley, the great philosopher of mind and psychology. He, I think, was known for saying that philosophy is maybe thinking at 33 RPMs. I think he said that. That's how I think of it. Like if you had a 78 and you turned it down, or nowadays you have computers and you have these software like the Amazing Slowdowner, or a lot of these programs where you can actually, without changing the pitch, you can slow the music down, and that's how musicians learn the songs. That's what I think philosophy is to the rest of inquiry. It's the Amazing Slowdowner for the rest of inquiry.
It's a slow-mo.
It's like, if you want to learn that argument, here's how you do it. Slow it down without changing its pitch.
Wow. That's really something. Yeah. Well, so speaking of speaking of arguments or bigger challenges, let's actually transition to the final question that I have for our for the interview, which is, what do you take to be the greatest challenge for you or facing philosophy of science as a whole?
I think there's so many challenges nowadays. We're living in a time when, and I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but it's not the most rational time in terms of public discourse and inquiry that I've lived through. I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but I feel that there's a lack of kind of rational thinking in the world generally. So this isn't just about, now I'm talking about philosophy in the broader sense.
Yeah.
And one thing, especially that you see now, is anti-expertise, especially in science, kind of anti-scientific expertise, anti-understanding kind of views. And I think this is very dangerous. And I think philosophers of science should really be thinking about this. And here's a great example. My friend Eric Winsberg just wrote a great book called Philosophy of Climate Science.
Yeah.
And I'm teaching it this semester at Northeastern, and I'm learning a ton. It's a wonderful book. And what he's doing there is not just the great philosophy of science that he does in the book of trying to understand climate science and understand the nature of computer simulations and understand modeling better and all that stuff that we need to do anyway in science, because that's how modern science works.
Yeah.
But there's also a very important strand in that book, which is about how do we convey and communicate science and philosophy of science to ordinary people and also to policymakers and to politicians and people like that. And I feel like this is such an opportunity for philosophers to put themselves out there and to help people to understand what's happening in science and what's happening in the world. We really need that now. And so I think philosophers of science, and there are many philosophers of science who are doing this, who are really trying to be involved in understanding science and explaining science to people, including scientists, but also ordinary people and policymakers. And Eric is just one example of a great many people who are doing this. I think that's an area where we really need to be working. not just because of, we're lacking a general scientific respect and understanding in the world, but also because philosophy itself and humanities more generally is kind of under threat at the universities now.
Yeah.
And it's not funded the way it used to be. And I find that very disturbing because, especially in a time like we're in now, philosophy and the other humanities have a lot to offer inquiry and understanding, and not just that, but they have a lot to offer socially and politically too. And so being at Northeastern, is a real privilege because now I get to work with all these people who care about applied philosophy. There's all these great applied ethicists like Ron Sandler and John Basil and Serena Parekh and all these great people who actually are trying to do something publicly with philosophy and in a way that applies philosophy to social problems and to things happening in society. I think there's a role there for philosophers of science to interface and to make a difference socially. And I don't know if I'm not sure I'm the guy who's going to be super helpful on that because I tend to be sort of really into my own foundational and theoretical work that I really just love so much and can't seem to escape from. But I guess if I would say that's an area where philosophers of science and philosophers generally need to get out there and be more engaged with social and applied philosophy. And I think philosophy of science is no different, especially given how important climate change is. Yeah. And that's an area of science that's being neglected and disrespected and ignored, just flat out ignored by the public and by policymakers. That's dangerous. And philosophers of science can change that in principle. And so I think that would be an amazing thing for philosophers to do. I don't think I'm going to get there with you, but because that's not really my thing. Yeah. But I guess I'd have to say that's probably the most important thing that I can think of right now. And learning and reading Eric's book and learning about the philosophy of climate science has made me even more aware of how important this kind of social engagement is of philosophy.
Very well said. So this has been the turn in the sciences. They've had, struggles with, getting more socially engaged. And there's these big movements towards science communication efforts. But then also there's this push in the history of science toward doing more applied science or let's say science with broader impacts and things like that. But at the same time, there's also folks who argue that we do need some basic research for basic research's sake, or for example, working on the kind of work that you do in formal epistemology, where there's not going to have an immediate societal impact, but it's still very important. So is there a way in which to better, so it's the case that we're saying everybody needs to go do philosophy of climate science, but is there a better way to, resolve the image of philosophy as a discipline that can do both?
Oh, yeah. As I say, I think there are many examples of people doing this. So if you look at setting aside the climate science stuff, just look at the work, as I mentioned, on agent-based modeling. So you have people like Brian Skirms and Kevin Zollman and Kaelan O'Connor and Jim Weatherall and Liam Kofi Bright. And there's all these amazing people, and Remco Heeson. There's all these amazing people working on applying agent-based models to social epistemology and to the practice of science and to understanding science and how science gets disseminated and how it works and how it operates. That is super helpful, I think, socially in itself, and not just foundationally, but actually can really make a difference socially. And so I think there's tons of people already doing this, and I consider them I will take them as formal epistemologists, of course. I will claim them. Yeah. Even though they're doing work that's much more applied and socially relevant than what I'm personally doing, because I'm more interested in the foundations of individual rationality, or even social rationality. But I'm really interested in the foundations and the normative stuff, and not so much the more applied stuff and how it interfaces with the social practice of science or the sociology of science. I think that stuff's so important, and I consider that to be related to, if not, falling under the rubric of formal epistemology, or at least I'd like to think it does.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Oh, very well. All right. Well put. Well, Branden, we've covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate you being such a stimulating and inviting guest and enlightening us on kind of a really good approach to doing philosophy and how to start a community. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with? Parting thoughts, anything we didn't quite get to cover yet, or last words?
Well, I just want to thanks for the opportunity to talk about this stuff, and I just wanted to reiterate how thankful I am to be part of such a community of people who are helping each other understand the world, and I am so privileged and blessed to be part of that.
Wonderful. All right. Well, have a good rest of your Friday. Thank you again for taking the time to chat this morning, and hope to see you at a conference sometime soon.
Thanks, Nick. It was such a pleasure.
All right. Take care, Branden. Bye-bye.